Hello, all you beautiful people. Welcome to The Nonprofits, a show where we discuss the issues of the day from a humanist and skeptical perspective. My name is Johnny, and I'm here today with Jena Miyu and Kurt. The Nonprofits is a product of the ACA, a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the separation of religion and government and promoting positive atheism. You can support us at Patreon. At patreon.com/thenonprofits. And if you like what we're doing today or you don't like what we're doing, please email us and make comments. You can email us at radio@atheist-community.org. We've got some new segments and new things to talk about, but we've got some new people that you're going to meet today too. I'm here, like I said, with Kurt and Jena Miyu. Jena, you are not new to the Atheist Community of Austin or the atheist community at large, but you are new to our show. Where do we know you from? Where should some of us know you from?
Yes, so most way be familiar with me off the Atheist Community of Discord, also known as ACD, which is the fan-based server for the ACA community. So I am presently a moderator off that Discord. So I've been a moderator with them for about a year now. And so I've just been acclimated to talking with users and just being a part of the community. It's been great so far.
Oh, we're so happy to have you here on this show.
Yes.
And I hope you're not leaving the Discord because you're on this show. I hope you're going to be able to do both.
Oh, no, I couldn't possibly.
That's great. And then we also have Kurt. Now, Kurt, people might have seen your face someplace before. Where would they have seen it?
So I've been call screening for Atheist Experience, Talk Heathen, occasionally Truth Wanted, or Secular Sexuality since I think August or so. So I've been, I guess, a little bit of a familiar face. I've gotten to know some of the people, and that's how I got to know Johnny, and that's why I'm here.
Crew love. We're true crew members. Even if we're on a show, our hearts will always belong to call screening and modding. Am I right?
Always.
Always.
Okay. Well, thanks for being on the show, and we hope to see you here very frequently. We've got a lot of new faces with the nonprofits, and you two are two of the newest. So we've got some interesting topics to cover today. Here's some things you're going to see. All right. We got the first article: armed guards at Florida polling sites say they were sent by the Trump campaign. We're going to talk about that. Article 2, atheist advocacy group sues state over religious voter oath. That atheist advocacy group is nothing less than the FFRF, and we love them here. We've got a new segment here we're going to introduce. It's called Shit Internet Apologists Say, and we're going to be covering the top 5 most irritating things that theists say to atheists. I'm sure that the viewers at home will have heard some of these, if not in person, at least online. And then Article 3 is going to be Violating IRS Rules. A Texas pastor tells the entire church to vote for Trump. Something seems fishy about that. And then we've got a little bit of a funny article here about, well, I'll save that for the end. Let's get that one toward the end of the episode. Let's start off with the first article. Armed guards at Florida polling sites said they were sent by the Trump campaign. This is from rawstory.com, reported October 22nd, 2020. Sarah K. Burris is the reporter. Kurt, I think you were going to take this one. Is that right?
Yeah, and just to quickly summarize what's been going on here, there were a couple of armed security guards that showed up at a polling place in Florida, and they were hanging out. They were armed. They were setting up tents. There were Trump signs all over the place, and some people were getting very confused. Were they legit? Were they not legit? Are these just bullies? Are they here to intimidate voters out of voting for Biden? You know, given the propaganda, all the Trump signs that were there, they even said that they were sent by the Trump campaign. Now, it does sound like that in particular is not confirmed. They claimed it, or at least we're told that they claimed it. The Trump campaign has denied it, so we don't know for certain. But at the very least, they're obviously in that camp. That's where they come from.
Yeah, I did some research into this one. Definitely saw that the Trump campaign denies that it hired armed guards. And maybe I'm being a little Pollyanna here. I'm assuming that the Trump campaign is not so stupid that it would actually pay armed guards. Why would they have to when for the last several months, he's been talking up a storm about getting volunteer observers to go to the polls. One of the articles that I found here is the Minnesota Star Tribune. Trump campaign has vowed to raise a 50,000 plus army of volunteer observers across an array of battleground states to monitor the voting, raising fears of elections, he says, will be rigged. So something that we were talking about before, Jenna, how do these observers plan on stopping the rigging by being there? What does that even look like?
Yeah, certainly. So it's an act of intimidation is what it is. So you stand outside this polling place, whether inside or outside, more likely by law, it's outside, and you're dressed in military garb. You're brandishing these AKs or whatever have you, military style firearms, in order to cause some type of intimidation to people standing in line, which causes disruption, unsettledness with the people there trying to just, turn in a ballot or cast their vote. But it's that type of thing that you see when it comes to Black Lives Matter protests. Oftentimes, very much so right after an unlawful killing of a Black man or woman or individual, we have these protests, unfortunately. And unfortunately, private business places are burned. So same thing. When those unfortunate riots occur on those private and businesses, you have these people taking it on themselves to just go to that event, that situation, brand these military style firearms dressed in this garb just to enact some type of intimidation to deter further issues that may occur at that time. And unfortunately, accidents, violence, abuse can occur. So it's the same type of situation in which you're deterring people from casting their vote and trying to turn them away from just being in their rights, simply.
So, Jenna, I think you're probably coming at this from the same perspective I am, as far as this isn't, in no way is this reasonably calculated to prevent voter fraud. This is a very transparent attempt to engage in voter intimidation, right?
Exactly.
Kurt, how do you think about this? What do you think?
I'm pretty much in agreement. The only thing that I can think of, and it's really just because I like to play devil's advocate, right? The only thing that I can think of is that in a scenario where fraud was going to occur, is it possible that seeing armed people outside ready to get in your face and kick you out or whatever it might be, could that be intimidating? Could that prevent somebody? Maybe. But as I understand it, the amount of voter fraud that we see in this country is so incredibly low that it's almost not even worth it. It is not even worth it. We've seen very few cases in the last decade. The cases that we have seen have generally, well, I guess they've all been caught if we've seen them. But maybe we've missed a few, but there's no reason to think that they've impacted the election in any significant way.
Playing off your earlier point, Kurt, I may say, as far as it being a true significance, if that is intimidation, it certainly is, especially in the eyes of a minority person. We see this classically as an example back in the civil rights movement, leading up to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, where there were not only de jure segregation or lawful segregation of preconditions placed on not only poor African Americans and Latino Americans and Native Americans, but also poor whites, especially in the South, where you enacted these preconditions of literacy tests, I should say. And having to enact a poll tax where you literally pay out of pocket I believe a matter of, in Mississippi, it was like $2 to just pay that fee just to cast a vote.
And just as a reminder, of course, $2 worth a lot more the further back you go in the past.
Absolutely. And I see this parallel of that poll tax today where states, I can't recall a specific state, but there's quite a few where there is a similar situation with poll taxes in the form of strict photo ID laws. And these photo ID laws, for instance, most of which have been enacted just earlier this year, coincidence, where the individual that appears to their election office site must first have a provisional ballot, and they must present with a photo ID. And mind you, it's not even a driver's license. It must be a certain kind. They must present with that photo ID. Then they get their provisional ballot and they cast it. But it doesn't end there. They have up into 2 to 3 days post-election day to return back to the site to cast that provisional ballot again, just to confirm that that is that person that's casting that vote, so they can somehow, lessen the idea of voter fraud. That's ridiculous. So you first go in person to show that you are a citizen, to show that you live at such address that's listed, and then you have to return back a few days later after post-election. That's absurd.
It's interesting to me how there have been so few reported instances of voter fraud. Although I suppose if it's so rampant, it's easy to get away with, you wouldn't find it. But it seems like it's an overblown response to something that isn't as prevalent as the people who are concerned about it would say that it is. And it just so happens coincidentally to disproportionately affect minority groups and individuals who are economically fragile and vulnerable. Those who would vote, or who may, or are perceived to, let's say that, to vote in favor of one party versus another. It seems like this is an example of a kind of another example of tampering with votes, like gerrymandering across the country, enshrined into law.
Right. It's the deliberate intention of driving down the voices of the lesser. And it's unfortunate in part of where we come from in history and how it's the same reflection of it today.
Yeah.
And just to kind of rope it back into the article a little bit, the definition of voter intimidation from an attorney, David Singer, it's considered to be anything that gets in the way between a voter and that voter casting a ballot. Anything. And there should be nothing preventing an American citizen who has the legal right to vote. And that's one of the reasons why Florida, and I believe many other states, bans groups from soliciting voters within 150 feet of the entrance of the polling site. And from what I understand, the armed guards that were there were outside of that 150-foot range. They did have firearms, but they were legally allowed to carry them because they weren't within that 150-foot range.
Sure, but think about that. All you have to do is form a ring around the polling place, and you have to go past this, what could be perceived as a picket line, right? Picket lines have been effective in the past in discouraging people to break strikes and what have you. Bringing in, they used to call them scabs, people who would have to go through the picket line to go and work when the union was protesting, right? It seems like such an ineffective way of preserving the individual's right to vote by saying, okay, we're going to make it 150 feet. Sure. So they form a 150-foot radius circle around the polling site.
My assumption is that the 150-foot limit is more of just a matter of manpower. If you want to push it out to 300 feet, 500 feet, a mile, how many people do you need patrolling each polling site? I mean, places are already closing polling sites down due to, well, in this case, the pandemic. There's shortages of manpower. There's all kinds of things going on in the world today. So my assumption is that the 150 feet is really just a matter of convenience. It's a matter of, hey, are there visible people within that range? That sort of thing, rather than any specific radius.
Right.
Jenna, were you going to say something?
Yes, I was going to add that I recognize the irony and the difference. And when I say that, the irony and the difference is way back when Black Panthers stood on the steps of City Hall, branding, military style weapons, standing there to stand up for their civil liberties.
Right.
There is a full outrage from, mostly the white community about these, menacing Black men holding these weapons, looking like they're going to intimidate, looking like they're out to, cause trouble and wreak havoc. But you see that same thing occurring outside these voting places in Florida or where have you. And there's very little, especially in the top political offices, and from people like our president, from people within that administration, from just that type of side of politics, there's very little noise. And I just think it's so ironic that it's oddly similar, not saying one's better than the other, but how loud it speaks when one side does one thing and the other side does another.
Well, I found some things directly related to that. So we've got these people, Minnesota. I picked Minnesota just because it came up pretty quickly, but why not Minnesota? It's a battleground state, right? Minnesota GOP officials say roughly 3,000 people have signed up so far. This was as of I think last week, and we'll get training on state election laws which forbid campaign workers to interact directly with voters. Now, what has been the response by government, which is what you're talking about here, Jenna, right? And it's NPR said most jurisdictions are not planning to post uniformed police at polling stations because tradition and local laws keep officers at a distance to avoid an impression of voter intimidation. If things get out of hand, the police are usually allowed in if called. Well, Democrats in Miami complained about a uniformed police officer wearing a Trump face mask at an early voting location. He faces potential discipline by his department. And as far as there being no action on the part of the higher ups, the North Carolina Board of Elections did take some action. They issued a memo, very effective memo, reminding uniformed police officers to stay away from polling places, and state Republicans, surprise, surprise, objected. Republican State Senator Paul Newton said the board, which is controlled by Democrats, overstepped its authority and that it can't tell police what to do. Quote, "We want to respect the concern about voter intimidation," Newton says. But he says because voters have other ways to cast ballots, it's not a valid issue. Someone has to face down a uniformed law enforcement officer to vote in North Carolina. I just don't understand this. It's on the one hand, early voting through the mail has been invalidated, has been disparaged. And now going there's this lower tolerance for voter intimidation. There's no creative thought when it comes to voter intimidation in this instance, but there's so much creative thought as to how there's going to be voter fraud taking place in these other areas. It's this double standard. Thoughts about that?
Well, I think for me, it's just I keep thinking about everything else that I'm hearing going on. Right. I hear stories about, I think it was Philadelphia, and just recently there was a lawsuit, and now these ballots that were mailed in can be thrown away over a mismatched signature, things like that. And there's so much going on right now, especially with the new Supreme Court nomination, not nomination, she was confirmed. There's so much going on right now where things are still changing. We're 5 days away from the election, right? Or the official election day, and rules are still changing about where polling places are going to be. Democrats generally fighting to have more open in more places. In a lot of cases, Republicans trying to limit them. There are issues with mail-in ballots. Are they going to be counted? There are issues with ballot boxes. Here in California, where I am, literally being set on fire, people dropping flaming newspapers into ballot boxes and just messing it all up, or they then had to waterlog the ballot box just to get it there. The steps that people are taking, not just in government, but individuals, just like with the voter intimidation, to try to prevent people from voting, not get people to vote, but prevent people from voting, to invalidate those votes. The signature mismatch that I talked about in Philadelphia, people would most likely not find out that their ballot was invalidated. That was a hard sentence to say. People would most likely not find out that their ballot was invalidated until a few weeks after the election. There is no need to notify them before then. It's absolutely insane. And I do not understand how anybody can look at what's happening right now, look at what appears to me to be just blatant voter suppression on so many fronts.
Exactly.
They're playing both sides. They're trying to have it both ways. And it's depressing. My God. I don't even know where to go anymore. I don't know what to do.
Well, can I say this? I think it's interesting how the self-identified liberal progressive folks, who are a significant portion of the country, center left, right, are talking a lot about voter suppression now because there are those in our country who are taking such flagrant actions, okay? And yet I would wager that those same people transported 50 years in the past or 60 years in the past would have been uninterested in voter suppression amongst African Americans, Latin Americans, Chinese Americans. I just finished a book on the history of the Chinese in the United States. And I joked with my friends, spoiler alert, it's been a long, nasty, nasty road for Chinese Americans and people who came to this country. And the flagrant, the blatant, the shameless voter suppression, citizenship repression, every kind of rights that you can imagine were denied people without any attempt to hide it. But now that it's happening to people of, let's say, a waspy demographic, now people are talking, now people are concerned, right? I doubt there wasn't that much coverage in the news 50, 60 years ago. There wasn't. It was just something that certain communities had to deal with.
Right. Yeah. And let's be real. Playing off what you said, Kurt, playing off what you said, Johnny, we obviously know who they are targeting. It's blatantly clear. And unfortunately, the same type of people, or the same people, I should say, that are voting for Trump are those same people that are being infringed upon too. And it's exactly what you said, Kurt, like they're having it both ways. I'm curious as to how most of them in that office are voting. And, given the whole pandemic issues that we've had this year, I mean, it's been quite a year. And we have been voting by mail for years. Now, obviously, it's something, now they want to spring about this whole voter fraud issue just to add more to the fire. I mean, back in 2016, in our previous election, the voter fraud issue then was, people are double voting. They're going one day and then they're voting by mail and then going in person to cast a double vote. That's why, the numbers for Trump were weird, but ultimately he won, yada, yada, yada. That's why he lost the popular vote, but he won the electoral vote. I mean, that's another argument in which we just need to get rid of that whole electoral BS. Please. I mean, that's the only time in an election where popular vote doesn't essentially really matter. That's the only time. But besides that, it's clear to me, it's clear to majority of Americans, it's clear to majority of people outside of America. It's too often I hear on the fan server of people from all over mentioning and being in tune into what's happening. And you know, they talk to Americans and they're like, how can you put up with this? How can you continue to allow this? How did you allow this?
Mm-hmm.
It's blatantly obvious what they're doing, and it's just deterring and driving away numbers further and further down of people, you know, and you know, going about and acting their rights as citizens to vote. We've already been through this over 50 years ago. We've already walked and pressed for these rights for individuals to cast their vote, to do their civil duty. And we just slowly and slowly are entrenching on more and more people just to remove that. And it's ridiculous.
It is. And, you know, the people that would think it's not such a big deal, or that certain people don't have a right to vote, or they shouldn't be able to vote because they're uninformed, or because they don't contribute, or whatever kind of sick, demented rationalization they have for it. I got terrible news for you. You start infringing the rights of one group, those rights are going to infringe for you eventually. You know, there's a lot of great examples of that. You know, they came for the gypsies, but I wasn't a gypsy. You know, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a gypsy. They came for the Jews, then they came for me. And I don't know. I think how can we deal with this? Well, we need to brave those polling stations. Go there, vote once, and then track your vote to the extent that you can in your state, and encourage others to vote. And then your civic duty doesn't end when you vote, when you pay attention to the election cycle, and then you go back to watching Neon Genesis Evangelion. You've got to go back and you've got to continue to be involved in your local politics, in the board of electors for your state. Get involved in, you know, the mayoral, the citywide elections, and what have you. We could keep talking about this, I know, but I think we need to move on to the second article. Second article is Atheist Advocacy Group Sues Over Religious Voter Oath. This is an interesting article. I believe I was going to cover this one. It's an AP News article. Takes place in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm sorry to say that Montgomery, Alabama is probably had a lot of these. When I saw it was Alabama, it didn't surprise me. All right. And what happened was FFRF, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, has said that Alabama is the only state that requires voters to swear, quote, "So help me God," when signing their voter registration form. The Wisconsin-based group is filing a lawsuit against the Secretary of State of Alabama, John H. Merrill, on behalf of 4 Alabamians who said their constitutional rights have been obstructed because they are unable to swear a religious vote. Now, I did a little bit of research into voter oaths, all right? And the phrase, "So help me God," has been enshrined in oaths of one form or another for government purposes since as early as the Judiciary Act of 1789 for U.S. officers other than the president. I believe that the oath of the president started with Abraham Lincoln, started with George Washington, and every president has said, "So help me God," as far as I was able to find out. So there's a long history of "So help me God" being in these kind of oaths, but that doesn't mean it's right, because and this is so we talked about this a little bit before the show. We found a lot of the same news that was an AP News article that we found, but it sent us to the Freedom from Religion Foundation. There's another article there. A 1972 case, Nicholson versus Board of Commissioners of Alabama. Again, State Bar Association. This time, court ruled, "We hold that it is a violation of the Constitution for the state of Alabama to compel the plaintiff to swear an oath invoking the help of God as a prerequisite to entering upon the practice of law. FFRF was well aware of this, and they had sent a letter to the Secretary of State of Alabama, noting that any requirement for religious oaths violates the First Amendment, which bars religious tests. And they cited to a case called Torcaso v. Watkins, or Torcaso, my mistake, Torcaso v. Watkins, where the Supreme Court held that neither a state nor the federal government may force a person to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion. It's a well-settled issue, said the letter. So what did Jena and Kurt, what did you find on this?
I mean, I found there's a lot there. I mean, it wasn't just the First Amendment, which of course bars religious tests, but the First Amendment mostly addresses the federal government and the establishment of a federal religion. But then there's also the 14th Amendment. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. It basically, from what I was reading, extends the protection of the First Amendment and other amendments to work at the state level as well as the federal level. So if the federal government can't make you say, "So help me God," neither can a state. Then that's pretty much laid out. I read about Torcaso v. Watkins, like you said, the cannot force a person to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion. There was a case in, I believe, 2014. I found an article where there was an Air Force member who was forced. Sorry, that's not right. He was discharged, I believe, because he wouldn't swear to God, because he wouldn't say an oath that was, "So help me God." And the American Humanist Association actually helped fight against that. And it ended up being decided that an individual may strike or omit the words, "So help me God," from enlistment or appointment oath if preferred. So even if there is, and I think that there is in many states, there are oaths, not necessarily voter oaths, but oaths in general that you can take that will include "So help me God," you can not say it. Heck, the Pledge of Allegiance, you don't have to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I remember when I was a young lad in school, I would say the Pledge of Allegiance. I would leave out "under God" every time I said it before I just stopped saying it altogether, because I was like, why am I saying something? It reminds me of that George Carlin skit, right? Where people are gonna say what they're gonna say. Do you swear to God? Yeah, sure I do. Do you swear on your mother's grave? Yeah, of course I swear on my mother's grave. It's if people are going to lie, they're going to lie. If the idea is that you want people to tell the truth, and compelling them to swear to God should compel them to tell the truth. If you want somebody who doesn't believe in God to say, "So help me God," you are immediately defeating your own purpose in having them take the oath, because they're going to be lying from the outset.
Right.
Leading off of that last point, Kurt, it loses the meaning, essentially, right? If you're just going to say what you necessarily have to say just to get what you have to get, then what's the point? And, based on this article, fortunately, Alabama is presently the only state in the U.S. requiring voters to register on a form of mandating them citing a religious oath. So fortunately, Alabama is the only case. But I recognize two things with this. One is the enforcement of having atheists and non-Christian faith believers to swear to a God. So, I mean, what God are we swearing to, right? I.e. Christian God, ideally. And then two, the disallowance of an option to give a secular affirmation instead. Like Alabama is vehemently telling you that you must swear a religious oath, no option to just swear an affirmation without the religious oath. And even like Kurt said, why even have to do that? There's certainly a majority of the states do not require this. And I recognize this as because the favored dogma in America is Christianity. Not only does this mandate in the state impede on atheists, but also on non-Christian faith believers as well. This article is taking on a divine oath notion. And that is due in part because somehow we are under this perception that this country was founded on Christian values. And I'm sure, as we had talked earlier, and Andrew Seidel, based on his latest book, has something against that, right? This dogma is only favored in part because this is just the dominating religion that we have in America. And until we are able to fully equip more, hand up to FFRF for doing their part in trying to take care of this situation, who knows how much more widespread this can be potentially. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if more southern states opted to take up this kind of mandate, and then it comes to registering voters or going to the poll to actually vote. But fortunately, this is the only state with this type of case and who is upholding this ridiculous religious oath mandate. And I hope that, FFRF does win this battle in this.
And I mean, they should, as it was noted to the Secretary of State, they reached out. The Secretary of State said, hey, any changes to the form, we can't do that quickly. They require legislative action. The foundation actually said, hey, you, as the Secretary of State, have the authority to create and amend voter registration forms. Like that, it's laid out right there. And it's absolutely insane to me that this is still going on, that this sort of mindset still exists. And by the way, for anyone who doesn't know, that book by Andrew Seidel is called The Founding Myth, if I remember correctly. Oh, Johnny, we can't hear you.
Oh, no. There you go. Sorry about that. Some dogs barking around here. And no, it's not Dr. Vinny Boombatz. It's a bunch of little poodle dogs that live nearby. What states have voter oaths? I thought maybe this is pretty widespread. Well, there's 3 that I could find. And the FFRF article actually pointed me in the direction of them, and I looked them up. And I'm not going to read, well, I'll do the first one. The first one that I found was, and I think, Jenna, you found this as well, the original voter oath of Vermont. It was in the 1777 Constitution of the Vermont Republic. And there's an old version and there's a 2002 version. They're identical, except they say person instead of man. And I'll read this, the new version. Okay. It's short and it's kind of cute, actually. Every person of the full age of 18 years who is a citizen of the United States, having resided in this state for the period established by the General Assembly, and who is of a quiet and peaceable behavior, and will take the following oath or affirmation, shall be entitled to all the privileges of a voter of this state. It's cute.
That is so cute.
You solemnly swear or affirm that whenever you give your vote or suffrage touching any matter that concerns the state of Vermont, you will do it so as in your conscience you shall judge will most conduce to the best good of the same, as established by the Constitution, without fear or favor of any person. That's okay.
I like that.
Yeah. And then the Florida oath is, I do solemnly swear or affirm, and I found this on the Florida voter registration application. And I'm sorry, I kind of assume that things are going to be a little rougher in Florida, but this one was fine. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Florida, that I am qualified to register as an elector under the Constitution and laws of the state of Florida, and that all information provided in this application is true. This was a voter application form. That's where I found it. Can I say one more thing? And I've said a lot. The whole so help me God, okay? I have practiced in Texas as an attorney, and I have seen many witnesses be sworn in to testify, all right? And I think most of the time I've heard so help me God be tacked on to the end. Different judges would have it in, some would have it out. But what are you supposed to do if you're a witness in a case and you want to be regarded as being honest and truthful? and you're a witness. A lot of time witnesses are associated with one party or the other. They might be friends, they might be family members, they might care about the outcome of the lawsuit. If I were put on the stand, am I going to stake my friend, family members' fortunes or freedom so that I can say, so I don't say, so help me God? I think that it just goes to show you that although you have the right to not say, so help me God, there's still a stigma for those of us who don't believe in a God. And I think it behooves those in power to remove those oaths so that the culture can catch up. But we see those in power being very much influenced by the voter blocks of the religious. It's going to probably be very unpopular for an elected judge to remove "so help me God" from his or her courtroom, because come election time, the next judge, the rival judge, is going to say, they took "so help me God" out of the oath. What else are they taking out of your laws? They're taking Jesus out of the courtroom, things like that.
They're taking Jesus out of your schools. Ooh.
Yeah, they sure are.
I think that dials back to Kurt's earlier point where, to just bridge what you just said, Johnny, you say what you have to say for the necessary situation. I mean, this is kind of far removed from the actual conversation, but it's almost like you put yourself in a place where you have a family member on their deathbed and they just reach out to you and they ask for you to pray with them. Do you, as a secular person, as a non-theist person, I won't say cave, but in that moment, in their last moment with that person, do you just go ahead and pray with them just so that they can have a peaceful, transition of death?
Mm-hmm.
For me, yes. And in a situation in a court of law, if I was a witness or if I had to, say an oath to stand on jury, then certainly if I want to be there.
Yeah.
Because until, just like you said, Johnny, until there is some higher court that can, at one point removed, the whole Pledge of Allegiance under God from the schools, there will be some time until that can also be removed from putting your hand on a Bible and swearing to God in a court of law.
Oh, the Supreme Court has ruled on this. And even if the court and the legislature and all government forces step in to prevent us from having to say these things, the culture is still a bit behind as well. And you might ask, what's the harm in saying it? Well, it's death by 1,000 strokes. It's insulting to the intelligence of all of us that we live in a country that purportedly does not establish a religion, and yet here we are having to pretend like there is a religion, at least for purposes of oaths. Whenever we spend money, cash money, it has "In God We Trust" on it. There's Corpus Christi, Texas. All these this legacy of religion. Not to ignore the past, but why do we have to give favorable status to certain religious groups when it's enshrined in the law that we're not supposed to?
And I think it's worth noting that some of the things that you guys just mentioned, the "In God We Trust" on the money, the "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, these were not originally there. The original motto of the United States was "E pluribus unum," from many one, which I think is a much better catchphrase than "In God We Trust." That was added during World War II, right? During the whole Red
Was it the
Scare.
Cold War? It was the Cold War, wasn't it?
Right.
Cold War, was that it? Believe me, my history is not my best subject. But same with the Pledge of Allegiance. It used to be, the "Under God" wasn't there. I'm struggling to remember the Pledge of Allegiance right now, but I know it didn't used to be there. And it's crazy that these things were added in, and now people are fighting so hard to keep them there as if, hey, this is our history. This has been this way for hundreds and hundreds of years. No, those are recent. Those are not new things. It's And as far as the harm, I mean, like I said, it's self-defeating. Like I said from the beginning, it is asking somebody to swear to something that they don't believe in, which already defeats the purpose of swearing to it in the first place. It normalizes the idea of God. It makes everybody think that, hey, if you're a non-believer, you're alone. That guy said under God, or swore the oath to God. He's a believer, and that person's a believer, and that person's a believer.
Right.
Anybody who's a non-believer in that scenario is going to feel very alone. They're going to feel maybe even a little bit scared. And I'm not going to lie to you. Like you said, Jenna, saying what you have to say, if I was one of the voters that was being blocked by this, and I'm somebody who's been an atheist my entire life. Like I said, I stopped standing for the pledge. I stopped saying under God for the pledge when I was young. That entire thing, I'm not going to lie, I want to vote. I don't want to jump through these hoops. I don't want to have to wait for the Freedom from Religion Foundation to fight this battle just so that I can vote. Because my vote matters. And I would probably suck it up, sign the piece of paper, and vote.
You know,
because that's the only way I would be able to then try to get somebody in office that might be willing to change things. But either way, it doesn't feel good. It feels icky.
It feels icky. You would think that this would have been solved around the time of the Treaty of Tripoli. You would have thunk this was you'd have thunk that this was solved back in the early years of the country, because it's written down very clearly that Congress shall establish no religion. However, think of all the things that are enshrined in law that exist on paper but weren't true for millions of people, you know, that all men are created equal. Well, literally all men, and no, not even literally, all men, not women, and certainly not anyone that isn't a white landowner, right? It's written down. It says that we're all equal. It says that we all have these rights, and the people that formed the country patted themselves in the back for creating this perfect union, and how swell it was. We did this great job. So you think it would be all squared away, but in truth, there's an inertia of prejudice and discrimination and oppression that we still live with today. And this one cuts across racial and economic lines. This particular hypocrisy does. So it affects me, which demographically speaking, not a lot of things affect me, right? So am I going to put my ass on the line to stop this one before I fight for other causes? No, but it just, again, it goes back to what we said before, because it affects different demographics. People are more aware of it. And anyhow, I guess that's my little soapbox on this one. Any last thoughts on this one before we move on to our next segment?
Everybody go out and vote, honestly, because regardless of whether there's an oath, if there's an oath and you want to change it, you got to vote the right people in. Yeah. If there's a politician that is intimidating other voters and you think that this going back to our first article, and you think, hey, we need to do better about stopping that, vote. Run for city council. You know, try to do what you can to help. Make phone calls. Yeah. Talk to people. Talk to the people that you know who maybe are on the fence. Mm-hmm. I guess that's my little soapbox, but try to make a difference where you can, because everybody has some sort of voice. Not everybody is going to be on the front line protesting. Not everybody is going to be a city council member, but everybody has a voice. Everybody has something that they can do.
Jenna, what you got for us?
I think that's what
sorry, Kurt. Sorry.
No, go for it. Go for it,
Jenna.
No worries. I think the most important vote is voting down ballot. I already said, like, until we can get rid of the electoral college mess, because there's a whole other conversation that we can have on that and the history behind why that was in place anyway. Voting down ballot in your local community, in your city, voting for your mayor, voting for your governor even. It's a big difference from being here, similar to Kurt in California, where I don't have to have my license or show my ID. And I just recently turned in my mail-in ballot. I had no issues versus people in Alabama, versus people in Mississippi, versus people in Wisconsin and Florida and where have you, that have compounded upon top of each compounding issue to try and just cast their vote to fill in the bubble. It's ridiculous how hard and the many legacies that have passed on and are still with us that tried fervently to give everyone the right to vote. From way back when, post-Reconstruction, for a small amount of time, African Americans had that, they were given their civil liberties. Slavery was abolished and they had the right to vote. It wasn't until these, de jure segregative groups, Ku Klux Klan, that pushed against giving those rights to African Americans, leading into, women's suffrage. Women for years and still are considered lesser than the white man. We fought fervently to try and give women the right to vote, moving into African Americans when finally the Voting Rights Act was passed in '65, giving everyone pretty much under that minority the right to vote and eliminating these preconditions of trying to just cast that vote to fill in that bubble. But I think the most important, and I'll end with this, please, if like anything else, voting down ballot, voting in those local city areas, communities where true change, minute change can happen in your community is so much more important than voting for president.
Agreed. Again, we could keep talking about this. I hope that we're probably going to come back to this because, well, and I'll say this to the folks watching the show, we've got a kind of a format now where we're doing more of like a deep dive issues into sort of perennial topics that aren't time sensitive. And then we've got news shows, news focused shows. They talk about issues, but they're rooted in like a news article. And we're going back and forth. The election's coming up. There's a lot of news happening right now. We don't know what show is going to be aired coming up because the way that the voting situation is in this country, we might have a crisis where we want to cover more voting, more news, more ballot counting, more voter suppression, voter turnout issues as it happens. We're recording a lot of shows right now, and some of them, it might be a month until some of them are seen. We don't know. Hopefully there's a smooth transition of power, whatever that means, to the next president, the current president. I don't know. I'm not gonna advocate for a particular candidate. I have my own personal preferences. Probably not too hard to guess. But we're going to move on to the next segment, which is a new segment that we are having on the Nonprofits. Is called Shit Internet Apologists Say.
Shit Internet Apologists Say.
All right, so this is stuff that you've heard before. This is coming from an article in medium.com. It's actually pretty old. It's November 14th, 2019, a lifetime ago. And this was written by Michelle Steele. Basically what it is, it's the kind of bad reasoning, crappy arguments that you've heard family members, friends say, people calling the call-in shows, Look at the Trees. I don't think there's a Look at the Trees isn't in here. It's my personal favorite. But I'd like to open this up. I'm actually going to ask Jena Miyu, which one do you want to talk about first? And we're based upon how well this goes, we might come back to this again and cover this later. So which one do you want to start with?
The one that stood out to me the most, and I can speak to pretty personally, is the you secretly believe in God and you are just rejecting God because you just want to sin. Mm-hmm. I think, especially within the Black church, being a complete blasphemous against our Father, Lord, and Savior, Jesus Christ, is an immediate detraction from not only the faith and immediate enrollment into hell, I would say, but also a complete removal of the Black community as a whole. Also, it's not something you really experience outside of the Black church and other racial groups. And so to say that I secretly still believe in God, but I want to sin, means to me that I am prerequisite to, as a Black person, to adhere to this Christian faith, because wherever you go as a Black person, where especially if you live down south, you are immediately met with, "Hi, what's your name? What church do you go to?" Why is that the immediate reaction? Why is that the immediate encounter that we Black people face? And I'll tell you why, because it's ingrained in our culture so deeply. And it's ingrained so much so, ironically, because the only way we were able to read and write, and the only way we were taught to even speak, is because we were secretly taught scripture. And on top of that, scripture was used against us to, make us lesser and to just hone the idea of lawful slavery at that time. So to say, and then growing from that, just to move back into that quote about you just want to be a sinner, moving from that, we held on to this belief in a Christian God because, coming from slavery, we only read, and we're essentially foreign to this country because we were removed from Africa. We are, the only thing we have to depend on is ourselves. And the only community that we had was the church. That was the only safe haven until, violence was enacted upon us. And, we continue to see racial discrimination even today in many different forms. And for a person of Black background and of a Christian faith to denounce that ultimately means you're just removing yourself from that community. And so you're just pretty much saying, oh, you just want to live your life freely and just be a sinner for the rest of your life, which is not the case, because I myself recognize no belief in a higher power. And so to tell me that I'm just some type of awful heathen to just want to remove myself from a faith, but I know innately I'm a good person, it's just crippling. It's crippling, it's insensitive, and quite frankly, it's tiring and exhausting to try to explain yourself and try to match this identity for yourself. When, if you detract yourself from that religion, you detract yourself from that community, what do you have left? What do you have left but just yourself? And to find that representation within yourself, to make a point, a firm point and clear that I'm not out of this faith to be a sinner. I'm out of this faith because I can't uphold to this insensitive, violent book that has been used against us in history to put us down, to keep us in slavery, and to continually to perpetuate this racial discrimination and violation of our civil liberties as human beings, And it's disgusting.
Yeah. Well said. It is truly disgusting. It's also, it shows a small-mindedness as far as what makes a person good. What makes a person good? Is it their actions? Is it the time they take out of their day to make sure that people who are in need have what they need, that they take care of the people that they're responsible for? Or is it that they believe a set of beliefs, and that what we're just a few several thousand-year-old adages from an old dusty book from being terrible people? Does anyone really believe that about themselves? We see it on AXP and on Talk Heathen, where, well, what's keeping you from raping and murdering? And the answer is always, me. I do all the raping and murdering that I want to do. I don't do it because I don't want to go to hell. I do it because I don't want to be awful and hurtful and destructive.
I see that Penn Jillette quote that you're sliding in there.
Is that? I think it was. It was one
I
of the
do
old,
all the raping and murdering that I want. That's pretty classic Penn Jillette.
Exactly.
But I do want to push back a little bit because I don't necessarily see it as small-minded. What I've heard a lot, especially with everything that's been going on in the country, in the world lately, is just kind of a reminder that being able to worry about religion is in a lot of ways a matter of privilege, right? It's our place. We have this ability as people who have enough food to eat, and we have a home over our heads. And I hope that none of us are struggling too much for money, but of course with the pandemic, hey, you never know. But the point being, we're all in a position right now where we can worry about religion. There are a lot of people who live in this country where that can't be their main focus because they don't feel religious discrimination every day. They feel acceptance when they go to church. They feel love when they go to church. And they don't get that in a lot of other places, whether that's because of where they live or who they work with or whatever it might be. It ends up being something else. I don't think that it's small-mindedness. I think that it ends up, maybe for some people, sure. But in a lot of cases, it ends up being this refuge for people. And as much as I want them to find better reasons, better information, and maybe take the journey that so many other people have and maybe walk out of religion and into something that lets them be better and freer than maybe they've ever realized they could be. It's just not something that everybody mentally, emotionally has the capability to do at any given moment.
You know, I have to agree with you, Kurt, because I do agree that it's not small-mindedness. It's the lack of support from your country when you need to abide by being prideful and patriotic. And you look at that and you're like, I have nothing. You look at people that live on just the very fringes of just barely making it, especially during this year when people have lost their jobs, when people are barely making ends meet. When you have nothing, when your country gives you nothing, and there's just constant back and forth from both parties, and still nothing is happening, you're just lost. You are just debilitated, and you're frustrated, and you're tired. And all you have is this community. All you have is church. All you have are these people that are willing to serve you food, give their clothes off their backs, provide you shelter, whatever means they can, albeit if you are of that faith. I don't know how the circumstances if you don't adhere to that particular church, but I know within the Black community, within Black churches, this is the support that they have been they have tied themselves to since civil rights movement, since post-Reconstruction, since for pretty much the entire history, African-American slaves were brought over here up until now. They relied on the support system. They've relied on whatever they can to keep themselves moving and to have this aspiration that they're going to be okay because they're praying to God and they're keeping with their faith and they're keeping that strong. And unfortunately, because of this hard tug on support from that church, from praying to this God that even though you keep praying for X amount of years you've been alive and nothing has changed, it's all still the same, and you just pretty much settle on, oh, it's not my time, or, oh, I'll get it when I get into heaven, or that's a different life for me. It's unfortunately a crutch. It's a crutch that the Black community holds on to for generation after generation. And instead of thriving, instead of just opening our minds and being honest with ourselves and seeing what exactly is occurring and not occurring, because we're not getting help, we have to strive and stand up and be the type of thriving individuals that we can be and not hold on to this debilitating crutch that we have for over centuries.
You both make really fantastic comments. And I guess what I was saying when I said it was small-mindedness, it was like a lack of imagination that people could be good outside of God. But I suppose, and I hear what you're both saying, that if all the goodness is coming from a community that is substituting for the indifferent politicians, the indifferent police, or the hostile police, or the hostile government, then where would you come up with that from your own personal experience? And I think that might be where the secular community, maybe the atheist community, let's say that, can step in to show that there's an alternative, that goodness doesn't have to stem from superstitious beliefs or from an ancient book that has an awful lot of nastiness in it, that it can actually come from humans, that might actually be empowering, that we can be. We joke that I want the stereotype to be that atheists are good tippers, that we're, we have all these different virtues, that we're kind and we're patient and we go out of our way. Let's form these tropes instead of being untrustworthy, because polls show that atheists are completely untrustworthy, on par with child molesters and rapists. Let's show that we're extra trustworthy because we're coming off of many thousands of years of atheists being, antisocial, being maybe the only people that were willing to stand out as atheists in the thousands of years ago time were people that were especially either ahead of their time as far as seeing the world with a clear vision, or also people who were just contrarians who disrupted society, like Socrates getting put to death for being an atheist, even though it's a very lousy case for him being an atheist. I thought we might have gotten through more of these.
Well, just really quick, I do want to say I couldn't let this one go. You secretly believe in God, you just want to sin. Genetically Modified Skeptic actually did a really great video about this exact topic fairly recently. He went through a bit of his own story of how he was raised in the church. He was well loved. He was well respected. He got married before he was ever intimate with somebody. He never had a drink of alcohol until later in his life, that sort of thing. And he was just kind of asking the question, where in your mind did I go wrong? Why is this what you cling to? And I feel like he did a really good job breaking this down, maybe in a different way than we did, but I would definitely recommend people go watch that, because it really is kind of a window, especially if you are somebody who is religious and you feel this sort of way where it's, hey, you want to sin, that's why you don't believe. Genetically Modified Skeptic did a really great breakdown of that, and I think it's definitely worth watching.
Well, we'll try to put that link in the description if we can. But Genetically Modified Skeptic is a friend of the Atheist Community of Austin, and I've watched a lot of his videos. Really good stuff. We're going to move on to the third article right now. That would be Violating IRS Rules. Texas pastor tells his entire church to vote for Trump. And I believe, Jenna, you were going to cover this one?
Yes, indeed. So this article addresses, as you had mentioned, a violation of the Johnson Amendment, in which Pastor Derek Rogers, a pastor of a church, in short known as the Cowboy Church, told his congregation, and I quote, told everyone to vote for Trump because not doing so would allow evil to win. And if you're not familiar with the Johnson Amendment, it was a provision added to the U.S. tax code back in the 1950s. This tax code provision prohibited all nonprofit organizations from endorsing or opposing political candidates. So I did recognize two key points within this article. One being the claim by the pastor for insinuating that Democrats are out to take over everyone's religious freedoms. And two, how is this? This is obviously a textbook violation of the Johnson Amendment. Textbook. The author in the article exasperates that there is no strong confidence within the current IRS to actually take actionable, take action, I should say. Just take action plain and simple. And the writer takes note as far back as the previous election cycle in 2016, where there were churches across the country that were deliberately calling out the IRS because they were, you know, fervent people that wanted to hold up in arms and, you know, vote for who they wanted to vote for, and made that demand and loud and well known in their congregations. And unfortunately, presently only one church since that time has been audited. And even to this day, there has yet to be no penalty or actionable punishment that has occurred.
Oh, I'm glad you found that. I was wondering if one of you had found how many churches have had to face the music for this.
I think it was right in the article. I think it was just the one, and it was unclear whether it was audited for this exact purpose, for violating the Johnson Amendment, or if it was just, hey, there has only been one church, period, that was investigated.
Right.
It wasn't even about this, because there are tons of churches that are doing this right now. This is the one that we're talking about at this very moment.
Right.
But there are reports of tons of them. This is happening all over the place. And I don't understand, why do these rules exist if we're not going to enforce them? Why does the IRS get up everybody's butt about taxes except for the churches?
It's unpopular. That's why. Because the politicians who were in charge of the IRS would be raked over the coals if they started instructing their agency heads to enforce this. It boggles my mind why we allowed this. I think we talked about this the other week. It was on Discord. It was on a different show, but this whole idea that that there's tax exempt status to begin with for religious organizations, frankly, it confuses me. I know we did it because rather than having a state religion, we decided to let each religious group go relatively unregulated, and then they started gathering power, and then they started dictating the terms of government as opposed to the government dictating the church. But
we don't live in a theocracy.
It frustrates me. It frustrates me to no end. And we are very careful at the ACA, being a 501c3 organization, to not endorse a candidate. Right? To be very clear that we are not telling you should go vote for so-and-so, because we know how fragile our tax exempt status can be, as is every other organization that enjoys tax-free status, right? But churches can act with impunity. And we know that Trump earlier, was it this year or was it later last year, claimed that he had gotten rid of the Johnson Amendment. Do you remember hearing about that in the news?
I do.
Right.
Sadly.
It was, yeah. He
didn't.
made a executive order. I forget what it really quoted back in 2017, trying to lessen the restriction on the Johnson Amendment. It's not completely removed. He has no way of doing that, really.
Yeah. He just ordered that apparently it will not be enforced, says Kenneth D. Wald, a distinguished professor of political science at the U of Florida. I got some more quotes here. The executive order does not really involve anything with respect to the Johnson Amendment, says Lloyd Mayer, who teaches nonprofit and election law at Notre Dame Law School. The Johnson Amendment is still law. The ACLU said the order was an elaborate photo op with no discernible policy outcome. Public Citizen said it was a sham because what it actually does is instruct the IRS to enforce the law as written. I don't know if that's true. Conservative groups were disappointed. Although, quote, although we appreciate the spirit of today's gesture, vague instructions to federal agencies simply leaves them wiggle room to ignore that gesture, regardless of the spirit in which it was intended, said Michael Ferris, president of the Alliance Defending Freedom. The Alliance Defending Freedom.
You know, Johnny, it's just a lack of solid leadership backing. And I'm afraid in this instance, and lack of funding and adequate support, of course, will bring about lackluster enforcement of this law, or will easily be rebuked or swept under the rug for whoever knows how long. Because it's, like you said, it's not popular. It's not concerning anyone. And it won't be until some new administration, some new standing administration that can stand up and instill and affirm with more confidence and more competence and making clear action towards these churches in order for them to uphold that tax exemption, which I personally think they should not even have.
Yeah.
It's just the continued timidness and lack of actionable response to churches and clergy, and to continue to let this be swept under the rug and nothing being done is just upsetting.
Do you think that, as we've seen, that folks who I identify as non-affiliated or non-religious, people who are out as atheists, or generally skeptical, and not affiliated, do you think as those numbers grow, we're going to see a gradual eroding of this protective wall around the churches, and that we're going to see churches have to, prove themselves up that they're not actually endorsing for candidates? And how long do you think that's going to be until we see that?
I certainly hope so. I think it's going to take a long time, because we're starting with very small numbers. Our numbers, even though the none, quote unquote, group is the fastest growing in, I believe, both the United States and the world, it's still such a small population compared to the Christian population in the United States, and even some of the other religions that are in the United States, I believe. And as a result, it takes time. It's going to take a lot of effort. And the other thing is that we're spread out. Mm-hmm. It's not like, hey, if we get all of the atheists into these 10 states, we can take over those 10 states and then we'll have a voice. But that's obviously not how it works. We're all spread out in places where, hey, even if we have a growing voice, we're still a minority voice by far. So as a result, people with reasons to want to protect these religious tax exemptions will keep getting elected, until maybe we get either some people who are willing to listen to logic, sense, and reason, or we can find a way to get more and more atheists into office, which I know is something that the Freedom from Religious Foundation is working on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think also there may be a demeanor or a mindset that's different from the religious, from the skeptical non-believer type person, right? There's a joke around the ACA, getting it's not word for word, but trying to get a bunch of atheists to do anything is like trying to herd cats. Everyone's got their own ideas about things. Everyone is relatively fiercely independent. And one thing that's different, and we covered this in a different show that will be aired at some point, I promise you, is that there is a kind of openness to new ideas, individual freedom aspect as far as belief, and not being willing to follow in the leaders in a way, that a strong central command, whether that be your pastor or tradition or whatever it might be, is more appealing to more conservative voters than it is to the hippy-dippy non-believer. Now, with that said, we have people in the atheist community that are very conservative, that believe in a strong military, and they believe in a lot of different, typically conservative positions. But I think on the whole, my experience has been, I have my own world. I got my own life. I got to figure it out, and we don't follow a dogma, right? We don't vote in a unified way. Atheists in favor of like abortion rights, it's fairly divided, right? But in a church, you're probably going to see most people are aligned on that issue or in certain issues, whether it's one way or the other, based upon that denomination.
I mean, I will point out with that in mind that it's not like religious people are entirely uniform in their voting.
No,
I mean, there are the religious people who think that Trump is the second coming, practically, right? One of the quotes that I found I don't remember if it was the article that I was reading that we were actually going over, or if it was one of the many offshoots that I found, but it was saying, hey, Trump will fight for Christianity and the Bible.
It was that one.
The other party is going to fight to take away every religious freedom and every right we have as Christians. That's one side. But keep in mind, Joe Biden is a devout Catholic. He talks about his Catholicism, his religion, and how much he cares about it far more than Trump does. It's a vast spectrum of religious people as well. It's trying to herd anybody is really like trying to herd cats.
That's
honestly.
fair. I was overbroad with that one. And, you know, I talked to a friend of mine today, and I'm not going to say who we voted for, but I mentioned him before, my friend who's Catholic. I grew up Catholic, and I told him, well, I voted. And I said, just like you, straight down the ticket, right? And I'm not going to say which side of the ticket I voted for, but that's the thing. We're both of very different metaphysical belief or not belief states, but we both voted for the same party straight down the ticket for certain reasons, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily it was great going down, right? But we had our reasons for doing so. And Jenna, do you have something that you want to talk about with that?
No, just speaking back on both you and Kurt, there are a lot of blurred lines, especially even within Black believers that typically vote, on one side of the ticket straight down, but it depends on what it is. And obviously, if we know the Bible as well as we know we do, there are certain things that believers are fervently against, even though with regard to my family, they vote pretty liberally. But on certain issues, obviously, the obvious ones, they are on the other side of the aisle on it. So I'm just picking back on what both you and Kurt addressed. I certainly agree. It is a lot of blurred lines. Yeah. And yeah.
Well, we're running out of time here. We had a fourth article, and I'm just gonna touch on it very briefly. It's sort of something to laugh about.
It's a little more of a lighthearted note, right?
It's a no. We're not going to go into it. We'll just have our little laugh, and then we'll go on to the end. A priest was recorded having group sex on an altar of Pearl River Church. Police say 3 were arrested. This was in the Lights Inside Saints Peter and Paul Roman Catholic Church in Pearl River were on later than usual on September 30th. So a passerby stopped to take a closer look. Turns out that the pastor was half naked, having sex with 2 women on the altar. According to court documents, the women were dressed in corsets and high-heeled boots. There were sex toys and stage lighting and a mobile phone and a separate camera on tripods. Apparently, one of the individuals was a professional dominatrix. Good for her. And well, that's just something. That's what they imagine. I think a lot of believers might imagine that atheists do on our off time, is that we're in churches desecrating altars. Which, in this particular case, the church's altar was removed. It was burned after the priest and the dominatrices allegedly had sex on it. I want people to have a good time.
This is the sin. This is the sin that they claim we're trying to do. And I'm like, well, Christian sin too.
Sure enough.
It's not like this is the only example. I mean, this is one example that was caught very publicly. This obviously doesn't touch on the many, many child molestation charges that we find in the church. And there's just so much crazy stuff. Like you said, tying back to what we were talking about earlier, this is the sin. Right. This is that taboo. And this is how this repressed sexuality comes out with these people who are hyper religious. They, at some point, they almost break in a sense, and it has to come out somehow. Right.
I'll tell you what. Give me dominatrix 3 ways over child molestation any day. Everyone's an adult.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
Come on. If this was the problem the church was really facing, I think a lot more people would start becoming Catholic again. So, well, you know what? We could talk about this one a little bit more and make a whole bunch more jokes, I'm sure. But that's all the time we have for today. So what did we cover? Well, I'll tell you what we covered. Today we covered armed guards at a Florida polling site. We talked about FFRF suing over religious voter oath. We talked about some of the crazy shit that apologists say. Mostly you just want to sin. Sometimes. We talked about this pastor, this cowboy church. You've seen these cowboy churches on the highway, though. You maybe not in California, but in Texas, there's cowboy churches. I've been tempted to go in there. And of course, we talked about the good old times happened at the Pearl River Church. We were joined today with Jena Miyu and Kurt. We're going to be seeing a lot more of them if I have anything to say about it, and I kind of do. Please let us know, folks watching, what did you think about the new format? What did you think about these two wonderful people? If you liked it, let us know. If you didn't like it, well, you're wrong, but you should tell us anyway why we're wrong. You can email us with your thoughts, your comments, your ideas for articles, things for us to look at radio@atheist-community.org. And again, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thenonprofits. Thank you both for being here with me today. And
Thank you.
we'll see you next week.
Have a good night.